Welcome to Inside the Franchise Growth Engine, presented by Hex Growth, a firm focused on building predictable pipelines, scalable growth systems, and enterprise value for emerging franchise brands. These are real stories from real franchise brands, but we go deeper. Inside the Franchise Growth Engine, leaders unpack the systems, capital decisions, and operational discipline that turn growth into enterprise value. On today's podcast, we're joined by Paul Rocchio from the International Franchise Association, better known as the IFA. What makes this conversation especially interesting is that Paul doesn't just see one brand, he sees the entire ecosystem. From emerging brands to enterprise systems, he has a front row seat on what's actually working, what's breaking in franchise growth today. Paul, welcome to the podcast today. Thank you for joining us.
Honored to be here, and Monica and Don, thank you very much.
Yeah, we're super excited, Paul. So to get us started, give us a brief overview of your background and your role with IFA.
Sure. Happy to. Well, I've been with IFA for a little over 27 years. I like to say I'm a recovering lobbyist. Moved down to D.C. about 30 plus years ago to go to graduate school at George Washington University. Received a master's in political management, worked on Capitol Hill, then got involved in the association world. Kind of like franchising, everybody seems to fall into franchising. Same thing in the association world. People fall into the association world, and started at Chemical Manufacturers Association, then moved over to what is now called the Retail Industry Leaders Association, and was always doing government relations. And while I was there, was on a coalition with other folks from other trade associations, and was in a coalition with folks from IFA at the time, and they kind of courted me and told me to move over to IFA, and did that, and helped create and build our political grassroots program, our lobby day, which is now called our advocacy summit, and was doing federal lobbying when I moved over here to IFA. And about 2 years into it, just got, even though I'm still kind of a political geek, got fed up with government relations and lobbying, but really fell in love with franchising and working with all of our members, franchisors, franchisees, and suppliers. And an opportunity had opened up and kind of presented itself on the membership team here at IFA, and knew it would be a kind of a change of career path for me, and didn't think I'd be hanging my hat here for 27 years, but it's not every day people wake up and just love what they do, and I just love what I do. Just enjoy it immensely, enjoy supporting and working for all of our members. I mean, I always just like to say, and this is just me saying this, I mean, I like to say we're the stewards of this organization. It really belongs to the dues paying members. And if we don't have, members, if we don't have volunteer leaders, really, then there is no association. So yes, we represent franchisors, franchisees, and suppliers. And obviously on the franchisor side, as you mentioned, Don, it's not just one industry, it's 300 different industries, or we like to say 300 different verticals that all use the business format franchise model as a means of distribution and growth. And, at my other associations, or even my peers at other associations, they're relying on one industry. And what makes this so much fun is that it's just so many different industries. And it's crazy. There's days where things come across my desk. I'm like, what are they going to think to franchise next? And I've just seen some crazy things over the years, but, it continues to be fun.
So when you think about those 300 verticals, so you have visibility across the 300 verticals, hundreds, if not thousands, of franchise brands. What patterns do you see between brands that successfully scale and then those that struggle?
Historically, it was always food. In fact, whenever we have somebody new come onto the IFA team, I always like to ask them, "What's the first thing when you hear or think of franchising?" They always say McDonald's or Subway. It's always something in the food related space. And then when they realize that so much more, it kind of opens their eyes. But what I've seen over the years, and even within franchising, within our membership, we had a huge growth in the 2000s. And early in the 2000s, we reached 1,000 members for the first time. And we don't have everybody involved in franchising. I mean, I like to think there's probably about 2,500 to maybe 3,000 brands in the U.S. That means they have a current FDD, and they are actively, seeking to award, additional franchises. They may have a relative, as a franchisee, but they're, actively seeking to award, franchises. And we currently have a little over 1,100 members. So there's always enough out there to keep me and my small membership team. There's only 3 of us on our toes, always looking to bring new brands into IFA on the franchisor side. One thing I've seen, like early on, I always used to hear this, from on the franchisor side, they would take anybody who would fog the mirror, whoever they could get, to come on board as a franchisee, they would take. But then, franchising was really evolving and maturing, and franchisees were maturing. I mean, still the majority of franchisees out there are first-time business owners, single-unit mom-and-pop franchisees, even though there's a lot of mumbos these days, or what we refer to as mumbos, multi-unit, multi-branded operators, who are extremely business savvy. But there are so many, single-unit mom-and-pops out there, and that's the one thing, we do for all of our members, and the mission of IFA has always been the same since we were founded by Bill Rosenberg, the founder of Dunkin' Donuts. It's to protect, enhance, and promote franchising. And the one thing we do in terms of enhancing is we're continually educating all of our members on best practices and what it means to be successful, whether you're a franchisee, franchisor, or a supplier in the space. And I've also seen, franchising kind of change and grow. There's so many different service-related franchises out there now. And that is a very wide umbrella, whether it's, pet care, senior care, child care, commercial cleaning, residential services, disaster relief, or anything. It's a very wide umbrella, but it seems like, that segment has grown more over the years than any of the other, kind of 300, if you will, even though they fall, we break them down into various different segments, but that has grown more, from my vantage point than the restaurant food segment, or, the hospitality or hotel segment. And I don't see that really changing. That continues to kind of, really, really grow substantially, I think.
Follow-up question to that is, what do you think the biggest missteps or mistakes that emerging franchisors make in the early days?
What I always see and what I hear from, especially from emerging brands, is they really didn't realize how hard it was going to be a franchisor. I probably shouldn't say this, but like when folks call me and they want to franchise their business, whatever business it is, I try to talk them out of it, because I'm like, listen, it's not easy, it's not cheap, and at the end of the day, you're no longer in the dog grooming business, you're in the franchise business, totally different business. Of course, that's, I tell them that's, you don't have to join IFA, but that's why people join IFA, so they can learn best practices and learn what it takes to be a successful franchisor. And what I've seen over the years is, because there's, yes, there's competitors within each vertical, but franchising is franchising. It's all the same, whether you're grooming dogs, filling hotel beds, switching out mufflers, or, flipping hamburgers. Franchising is all the same. Obviously there's nuances, but people love to give back to people coming up the ladder behind them. I just see it. I see it all the time. And that's why I just, we all say how franchising is a relationship business, truly. But people just love to give back to people coming up the ladder behind them. And that's what I just love, because they're always trying to help out those emerging brands. But the one challenging thing for emerging brands is just, they don't realize how hard it is to, and I don't like to use the word or use the term selling a franchise anymore, because it's, they're really looking for, they're looking to award a franchise, but they're also looking for the right partner in a sense. They want to make sure they're bringing in the right people. Because then it's also making sure, because then that's the business you're in, is you're in the business of keeping, educating, that new franchisee and making sure that franchisee is profitable. And that's the business you're in. You're in the business of taking care of that franchisee. I don't care how many corporate locations you have. But look, as an emerging franchisor, if you do have a ton of corporate locations, then you should have enough cash flow to then kind of support your franchise business. But, until you become, royalty sufficient, and I think at least, in our world, we know what royalty sufficient is, but, until you become royalty sufficient, it's really hard if you don't have a lot of cash flow to really support, your franchise business. And if you can't support that franchise business, it's really hard to then support those franchisees and make sure they're successful. And, I always hear from, our members, our volunteer leaders, and this might be debatable, but, it usually takes, for a franchisor to be successful in franchising, they have to usually get to like that year 3 to year 5. Usually it's, somewhere between year 3 and year 5. And that also includes them being royalty sufficient. And again, how many units do you have to be to be considered royalty sufficient? I always hear different numbers. Some people think it's 300 or 200. And then some franchisors tell me they were royalty sufficient at 25 units. So, I think it all kind of depends. So that's always a kind of a moving target, but it's really, really as an emerging brand, it's just, everybody thinks, they're going to be the next, the next Jersey Mike's or, the next just big hot brand that's out there. And I always say hot brand. It's like when people if I'm on an airplane, I'm sitting next to somebody and chatting with them. Oh, what do you do? Fran, what's the hot franchise? It's like, not to digress, but I'm always like, if I knew what the hot franchise was, I wouldn't be working in a nonprofit trade association. I'd be a franchisee of that hot franchise. The real question you always have to ask yourself is, what are you passionate about? Because as a franchisee, franchising, it's hard. It's not easy. And you have to be passionate about, even becoming a franchisee. And if you're passionate about kids or pets or food or whatever, I always just go to the IFA website and whoever, you see listed, under all the different categories, find something you're passionate about and hopefully it'll be a good fit for you. But even on the emerging side too, it's just, being able to drink from the fire hose, because not everybody is successful as a franchisor. And I know, for example, Fran Data usually states that there's about 400, 350 to 400 brands that enter into franchising every year. And at least from my vantage point, we historically bring in, about 225 new franchisors, 225 to 250 new franchise brands every year, and about 125 to 150, and they're usually at the very bottom rung of the ladder. It's like a revolving door. Our retention rate in terms of a trade association on the franchisor side, it's always in the low 90 percentile. It's around 92 to 94%, which is, among my peers at other associations, our membership retention rate is very high and very strong. But again, as we all know, franchising, it's very diverse, and you have the legacy brands, and then you work your way all the way down, the maturity ladder to the small startup folks. And I would say there, the retention rate is probably like 60%, because, and for the ones who at least provide us with the feedback, hey, how come you've decided, to not continue your membership? It's always, we didn't realize how hard it was going to be to franchise. We're hitting a pause on our Fran Dev. We've got to regroup. Hopefully we'll be back in a year or two. But that, so it just, again, from my vantage point, it just tells me and shows me that so many of these new brands just don't always become successful.
I 100% agree with you, Paul. From someone who's worked with different brands and have colleagues in different brands and different industries, it's some of it can be scary because there are some that, it's at the beginning they want to grow fast and internally they can't keep up with that scale. And also too, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm gonna kind of shifting to the development specifically, is franchisors that take feedback from their franchisees, right? They've got to, I feel like they've got to be open to that feedback that's out in the field to be able to grow and learn from not only the franchisees, but their team that's been in that industry elsewhere, right? Saying, hey, these are things for, it's all for a good reason, right? Because you want them to grow, you want them to be successful. The concept can be fantastic.
Yes.
And you don't want them to fail, right? Because you've
Exactly.
seen that and you've been there and seen that with other brands. So what are your thoughts on that?
I totally agree with you, Monica. And again, from my vantage point, one metric I know that the regulators look at, and we know there's 14 registration states. The FTC regulates franchising, but it's not like the FTC has a police force, right? And there's non-registration states, and it is what it is. But I know one metric that even we look at when we're approving new members is, and I think when we were having a conversation prior to this, I always say sold not open, and I think one of you mentioned snow, and I'm like, yeah, I've got to start using, because everything's acronyms in this, especially in franchising, but in the association, it's all about acronyms, and so I stole that from one of you guys, snow. So I'm attributing that to you guys, but that is one thing, we look at internally, but also the regulators look at, because you always see, people posting on LinkedIn or just, God, we've sold 500 units, but how many of them are open, and how many of them will ever open, or will they never open, or how are you helping that, that first time business owner who doesn't know anything about site selection, or how, or the, yes, there's the franchise fee, but then depending on, on the concept, and if it's home-based versus brick and mortar, there's the overall cost involved to get that, that franchise up and running. And sometimes it could take 6 months to a year. And especially these days, it's just, it's challenging. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty out there, and I'm hearing it from everybody. And because of that uncertainty, but I will say that, that franchisors, entrepreneurs, they love a challenge, and even though it is a challenge right now, and there's a lot of uncertainty, franchisors or entrepreneurs tend to thrive on that, but because of that, it's if that new, either whether it's a new franchise or even a somewhat mature franchise, or even a re-emerging franchisor, and then that new franchisee, if they're not well capitalized, or if they don't have access to capital, it's really hard. And then there's so much competition out there. I mean, especially in the commercial real estate space. I mean, most of the developers out there, most of the properties out there, or the lifestyle malls now, they're like 90% or 95% occupied, and there's not much inventory, and everybody's fighting over, that hot location. And even there, it's, it's not cheap. Nothing's cheap. And it's a challenge. And the one thing I also see is, I'm not saying this is happening across all of franchising, but I am hearing more and more from some of our members that they are kind of hitting the pause button on Fran Dev, focusing more on the app side, trying to make sure that their existing franchisees are profitable, are strong, focused on unit volume, economics, if you will. looking at those franchisees in their system who are killing it, wondering why they're killing it, and making sure that they can then learn from that franchisee and have that franchisee talk to the other franchisees and mentor them, if you will, to make sure everybody in the system is strong and doing well. Because as we all know, if the franchisees are doing well and their sales increase month over month or year over year, that's more royalty back to the franchisor, and that's the lifeblood, of the franchise system. And so, I'm seeing that more or hearing that more from some of our members, and some of my friends in the fran dev space or even in the marketing space. I mean, I'm not saying people are getting laid off in droves, but there seems to be there's always a lot of movement in franchising, right? But we jokingly say it's very incestuous. People move from company to company, but it just seems like things are a bit of a challenge right now. And even though there is a bit of not a huge downturn in the economy, obviously gas prices and all the crazy stuff going on in the world, that's affecting like the restaurant space heavily right now a little bit. But I was reading yesterday, Oracle laid off a ton of people.
I saw that.
So we all know, we all know that, or I always learned early on, almost 30 years ago, that whenever there's a downturn in the economy, that's really good for FranDev, really good for the franchisor. Might, depending on, on the industry, it might not be great for the franchisee, depending on, who their consumer is, but it's really good for FranDev because though we don't like to use the term buying a job, but people are like, upper management, let's say, it's going to be a lot harder for them to get that salary that they had. And they've always had that, maybe that, just itch to own my own business, be my own boss, going into business for myself, but not by myself. They may have learned a little bit or heard about franchising in, depending on what industry they were in. And that's usually when they, I always say they wake up on a Saturday or Sunday morning at 2:00 and they start Googling franchise or franchising. And they usually end up, I like to think, IFA still is up in the top 3 to top 5 of, of various searches. And then they start educating themselves, and I always love it when people have done their due diligence, whether it's, a potential franchisor or a supplier reaching out to me about wanting to join or really even that franchisee. When they're doing their homework and trying to learn as much as they can, that to me is just phenomenal when I hear that, because, I always tell people you have to do your due diligence no matter what, because it's not something you could just, sometimes people are spending their life savings, right? Especially as a franchisee.
Absolutely.
On a franchise. And I like to think, again, IFA members are the cream of the crop. Our members are expected to abide by and adhere to the IFA code of ethics. They're continually being educated on best practices, networking with their peers. Again, it's relationship business, right? Everybody learns from everybody. The franchisees that are very involved in IFA, again, it's primarily for them. It's because of the lobbying we do, on small business issues, but it's really so they can network with other franchisees from other systems to see what they're doing that they're not doing, and they'll bring it back to their system, or it's to validate that, God, we're doing everything right at our system. Our franchisors are awesome. Let me educate these other franchisees what we're doing that they should bring back to their system. So I always love, seeing that just organically happen within the IFA family, if you will. And even within our members, but just everybody in, they call it the franchise family or the whatever, and it's true. I mean, it's just, it's, like I always tell people will leave franchising, but they always come back, and my big joke is, franchising, I could say this, I'm Italian, whatever, but franchising is like the mafia. Once you leave, you're going to come back. And even if you do leave, you want to come back, you get sucked back in, and it's true. I mean, I see it happening all the time. But you all know too. I mean, people move from company to company all the time, and whether it's the C-suite or definitely on the fran dev side, more than anything, I see it on the, but on the marketing side too. People just go from franchise opportunity to franchise opportunity, and that's the one thing that just makes this business model, because again, it's really not an industry, right? It's a business model, but that's what makes it just exciting and fun, right? That's what keeps us all involved in it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right? I often wonder, you said something earlier, I don't think I wonder as much anymore, but I think a lot of these emerging brands are also undercapitalized. You touched on that for a second. And I think this idea of we're going to pause Fran Dev to work on operations. I mean, success at a corporate level is either clearly defined. You have to have clearly defined goals. You have to have a clearly defined system that is built out that you can prove that it works. And then the last piece is if you're missing enough money or resources or staffing to make sure that your franchisees are successful, it can feel like a pressure cooker. And I think one thing we don't talk about is I think some of these emerging brands are let's franchise. Let's hope our royalty revenues are going to catch up and we're going to make this all work. And I spent 11 years working in Silicon Valley, working for some of the earliest stage technology companies. And there's a whole reason there's an industry called venture capital built around those early stage companies, because bootstrapping, believe it or not, we used to say this all the time, there's a point at which a company gets in terms of their growth where bootstrapping is actually dangerous. It's irresponsible for the whole business because you're literally trying to squeeze. Right, 100%, right? And so I think that's a silent thing we don't talk about, but as I'm seeing more brands and I'm like undercapital, I mean, I spent 11 years in Silicon Valley. I know what building early stage companies look like, and I can see some of these brands and I'm like, bootstrap, you're being irresponsible, you need to raise money. You need to raise money for these franchise brands.
Definitely apples to apples on that, 100%. And of course, I mean, I've seen private equity change the whole landscape within franchising, not just on the franchisor side, on the supplier side, and even on the franchisee side, whether it's private equity or family funds, and I see family funds more on the, at least from my vantage point, more on the franchisee side than I do on the franchisor side, but definitely private equity has changed the game. And again, we have a number of the private equity firms, the main players that are very active in IFA. Their brands are very active. Not all of their brands, but most of their brands are very active in IFA. But it's definitely, it's changed the landscape. And again, it's a relationship business, but it changes that dynamic of the relationship. And and I'm not saying it's good or bad, but I think I would hope that that my friends in private equity are hearing this and seeing this, because I'm not, this is coming from me. It's not, it's not coming from IFA. It's just it's what I hear and what I see. And they've got to be hearing it out there, in the franchising community, that something has to give. It can't always be about profit. I mean, yes, that, I used to, people used to, there are some non-profit franchises out there. We used to have this social sector franchising. It was primarily, these systems that were using the business format franchise model to provide healthy drinking water in, sub-Saharan Africa, or, in third world countries, or, providing, health benefits in third world countries, but using that, the business model to expand and grow and get either healthcare or, clean drinking water to folks that, normally would not have that. And, but it is kind of an oxymoron, because at the end of the day, it's like, franchising and profit. I mean, that's the whole reason why anybody, uses, decides to, franchise their business, is to grow and expand using somebody else's capital, right? that's why anybody, decides to, as a true entrepreneur, decides to take the franchise route instead of like what I just referred to as like the Starbucks route or the Shake Shack route. Because you might not be well capitalized, right? Don, again, it's like, if you don't have, enough cash to grow on your own, you might be able to, expand and have 1 or 2 or 3 locations. Now, let me take a quick step back because I've always heard from the experts that, especially on the restaurant side, if you have a concept that you want to franchise, and whether you work directly with a franchise attorney or with what I refer to as a packaging firm or a franchise consultant, if you're in the restaurant space, in terms of either the attorney or the consultant, packaging firm kind of doing a feasibility study, you have to have at least 3 locations if you're in the restaurant space. And those locations should at least all be profitable, that you've been able to create, a system, right, that works, and that you're always tweaking and fine-tuning that system. If this location's better than the other 2, why is that? Figuring that out before you even start franchising. So you've got a perfect system in place, right? And then you can replicate that system. That's what makes franchising strong, but that you can replicate it and then grow using someone else's capital, and then you're not responsible for the hiring and the firing, any of the HR-related issues or the real estate-related issues. Now, I know some franchise systems, and we all know, like historically, McDonald's drove me in the real estate business. They own all the property there, and they lease back. But, and I know what, I'm sure other franchise systems do that as well. But you know what I mean? At the end of the day, it's if you are not well capitalized, that is a huge issue. And even using brokers too. I mean, some of these, some franchisors, especially the emerging brands, and even some of the more mature brands, they will use brokers, they will use FSOs. And look, broker networks and FSOs are, not all of them, but most of them are all very active in IFA. And, I always hear the good, the bad, and the ugly from all of our members. It's like they're always, there's always in it, it's like they cost too much, but yet, it's the way I see it, it's easy for me to say this. Look, it's just another tool in your FranDev toolbox. And if you're getting, even one lead out of a broker network, hopefully more than one, but, that's one lead that you wouldn't have had. And if you don't like paying that franchise, whatever the broker fee is, and it, I never really get a straight answer from anyone of my friends in that world, but it's, 50%, 80%, 100%, it varies. And even on the FSO side, and, but then don't use a broker or don't go the FSO route. And then even, the experts tell me that, if you're an emerging brand and, if you're using an FSO or using a broker and they're selling 100 leads for them, just making up numbers, 100, they've sold 100, but then you're having to give a majority of, that franchise fee to the FSO or to the broker, then, well, how are you going to help get those 100 locations open? And then you have no money, I mean, and that's a big challenge. And listen, I mean, people have been, all the conferences I go to, and people are talking about this more and more and getting that message out more and more. And all I can say is that I hope it's resonating with everybody, with everybody, because at the end of the day, and again, like I said, we protect, enhance, and promote franchising. Protection, it's lobbying at the federal, state, and regulatory side. And, whenever there's negative legislation, whether it's at the state side or at the federal side, it's always because somebody invested in a franchise and they failed. Now, whether they failed because they were just not a good business owner and they should not have entered into franchising in the first place, or for whatever reason, they are disgruntled. That person always has a relative or a friend who is either a state legislator or a member of Congress, or they have a relative who works for a member of Congress or works for a state legislator, and they just complain, cry, whatever, and franchising is horrible. You've got to fix franchising, introduce legislation. That's usually how, I'm simplifying it, but that's usually how negative legislation has always come up, in franchising. And, back in the day, even when I started here, and I jokingly say, recovering lobbyist, but when I moved over to IFA, I was like, wow, I'm going to be kind of bored here because, we did not do a lot in the lobbying world. The only thing we did was if there was a franchise relationship bill that came up, federally or at the state side, that's all we focused on. We would sit on coalitions with anything else. But then I'll tell you, over the years, we have been having to spend more and more money to protect the business model. And if I was on the government relations team today, I would be, it's like nonstop. They are nonstop, constantly nonstop. And we have the best team I think we've ever had. And, putting politics aside, I like to say we're taking advantage of this administration. We're on the offensive, Matt Aller, our CEO, and Mike Lehman, who heads up government relations, and then Jeff Hanscom and Matt Cagle on the state government relations side, but then, Hader, who, on the federal government relations side, we introduced the American Franchise Act, and without getting into details, but it's the first time. I just feel like it's the first time we've been proactive. We're on the offense, not the defense. And at the end of the day, this will, codify joint employer for time and all eternity, and will remove the business format, business format franchising from the joint employer rule forever. And that has been, rearing its ugly head for 15 plus years now, and that has been preventing a lot of franchisors from providing a lot of additional services to their franchisees and really supporting those franchisees, because their attorney is like, that could be seen as you being considered a joint employer because you're getting too involved in supporting those those franchisees, or even supporting their or being seen as potentially even supporting the employees of that franchisee. And that has caused issues, I personally think, within the franchise model. And so at the end of the day, we have great bipartisan support. About, at least last I heard, I should know everything, right? But we had 70 co-sponsors on the bill, and but it's not a done deal. I mean, we're telling everybody, go to the IFA website. We have very easy, click a few buttons. It's going to send a template email to your member of Congress, and that's what they all want. They want an email. That's what they get, and they all respond to that, and they pass that along. They pass that along to their boss, whether it's on the House or Senate side. I digress. I know I'm all over the place, guys. I apologize.
No, it's good. No, this is good. This is good from, like we said before the call started, the podcast started. We're very interested from a macro level, which has been great. I think, Monica,
and again, like I always like to tell people, I have 27 plus years of useless knowledge up here about franchise. I really know. I have no idea what the hell I'm talking about. Now,
we could talk for hours, Paul.
I know, right? I know, seriously.
There might be a part two. We are have to do a part two.
I do have to kind of be. I do have to be a little careful, right? Because I just, with everybody I know in franchising, like I said, it's just, there's. We always like to think, there's the right way and the wrong way of entering and doing business in franchising, and look, you guys know this. There were brands that, gangbusters, in franchising, but I'd always scratch my head because I'm like, why are they opening up a location there? Why are they opening up And what do? They implode because they were probably awarding franchises to the wrong people, and they were, you know, those people were opening up in bad locations, and really too, it's like, here's the other thing, especially with mature brands, they tend to have like real estate support or onboarding support for franchisees, but and I don't know what the sweet spot is. It's probably, it could be 100 units and less, 50 units and less, but definitely the micro emerging or startup brands, emerging brands, let's say, but they don't have the bandwidth to really support and onboard those franchisees, I don't think, properly. And there's enough people out there that have created, businesses to do that. And even like, even through our educational foundation or CFE program, we have, online modules to help educate, everybody, but also to help educate and kind of onboard franchisees, if you will. But there's a number of folks out there that will do that, but that also costs money, and not everybody has that. So, and that's again why everybody has that dream to franchise their business. Look, a very good friend of mine, I was actually very good friends with his younger brother. We went to high school together. He started franchising it, his restaurant concept, and he had and then he was he was going to franchise, kind of like a spin-off of his main restaurant. And he quickly realized how extremely difficult it was. And he did not succeed. And I had, personally, I was hoping to, steer him in the right direction, put him in touch with the right people. And that one hurt, personally, because I just wanted him to succeed. And he had a great restaurant, I thought his idea, that he wanted to franchise was phenomenal, and it just, and he was a restaurateur. I mean, he was a smart restaurateur. Didn't work. But we, not everybody could be, Jersey Mike's or Subway or Two Men in a Truck or, Pure Clean or, the list goes on. I mean, I remember Nothing Bun Cakes. I remember my first phone call with them. They were like still operating out of their kitchen, basically, and they've sold to private equity 3 times already, and what was the, some of the others, or for that matter too, even our current chair, Sam Ballas, East Coast Wings and Grill, he came to IFA because he wanted to learn about franchising, and though he's a finance guy, grew up in the restaurant business and created this concept, didn't even have an FDD yet, but came to our convention in 2006 in Palm Springs, and 20 years later, he's the chair of IFA, and he's still a small regional brand, and he's very conservative about his growth, but he's focusing on emerging brands as chairman this year, and he's also focusing on unit level economics. He is all about the numbers and what it takes to be a successful franchisor. And then even like, Painting with a Twist. I remember the first conversation I had with them, and now they're, a platform company and Twisted Brands, and they've sold to private equity, a couple times. And again, it's like, I used to tell people, not that you're looking for an exit strategy, but there are always people in IFA, past founders or current founders of brands that are looking to invest in other brands, or even private equity. And, and people never thought about that, but now it seems like, and again, this is an overgeneralization on my part, but it seems like now people are almost creating brands in the hopes that private equity will acquire it, and they could cash out.
Oh, absolutely.
And I'm not saying that's everybody, but I just kind of my gut, but I kind of if at the end of the day, if there's one roach, there's 100, and if there's one or two people thinking I'm going to create this in the hopes that I could sell it to private equity, there's probably quite a few people who are doing the same thing, right? And I'm sorry to all my private equity friends. I apologize.
No, I think you're calling them. I think you're calling them to maybe look at certain brands that maybe need some help, that have a good concept, maybe have a great team, and just need some extra, oomph to get there.
Well, that's a really good point, because like back in the day, Fred DeLuca, the founder of Subway, very unassuming guy. He'd walk around like, the International Franchise Expo. When we used to, sponsor that event, and we had it here in DC. It was the only expo we ever did, and or the IFA convention. He had on like black Levi jeans, a polo, a beat up like brown backpack, and like Reebok high tops. And I'd always like to tell people, who do you think that guy is? And they're like, I don't know. He kind of looks, like he just walked in off the street. I'm like, he's probably making $1 million a day, probably $2 million a day, just walking around. The founder of Subway. So he used to come to our convention, and he would find these new brands. He would always want to be he would always want to be an ambassador. He's like, Paul, I want to be an ambassador. We had the ambassador program, but he would love to find these, these new brands that he just really thought would kill it. And I have no idea if he invested in them, like as a family fund, if you will. But he would send his whole development team to that brand and help them just grow and expand, and use his knowledge base and his team's knowledge base. And there's a handful of brands that, that he did that with. But then there were other brands where he would be like, I'm sorry, but you guys are never going to succeed in franchising. Well, why are you saying that? These guys just joined. What the heck? Why? But he was right. I shouldn't.
Yeah.
Anyways,
great.
But yeah, I mean, he was unique in that respect, And I'm sure that, look, there's so many people that, past chairs of IFA, past board members, past founders of brands that are, still very, very passionate, which is a big change now too, because it's like, it's like the next gen, and I'm not just saying this for this association, but any association, it's, getting people to join. If I'm talking to somebody who's just not a joiner, I could talk until I'm blue in the face. They will never join IFA. I don't need to learn or understand or do. I could do this. I could go about this alone. But the people who understand, just like franchisees, that's why they enter into become a franchisee. Why should I go about it alone? I have the support of the franchisor, but the other franchisees in the system. Same thing, in the association world, especially in franchising. Why should I go about franchising alone? I should join IFA and learn from everybody who's been up the ladder before me, and not make those mistakes. I cannot begin to tell you how many times I've heard from our members that they had wished, they always thought they had to have like 50 units or 100 units before they joined IFA, and they always tell me, I wished I had joined right out of the gate, even if I didn't have the cash, because I would not have made all the mistakes that I made if I was a member of IFA. And I'm not saying that, doesn't mean everybody who's a member is successful, or that if you're franchising, whether you're a franchisor or franchisee or supplier, that you have to be involved in IFA. But, it's all about just, why go about it alone? And again, franchising is a relationship business, and you don't have to go about it alone. There are so many people out there who are willing to be a mentor, right? And give back. Not everybody, but I like to think most people.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I feel like Don and I do that all the time. When we talk
exactly. I was going to say, you guys are doing it. Yeah, you guys are doing it right now.
We're trying to prevent them to make, some of the mistakes that we've seen in our years. So yeah, we get it. But no, Paul, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Oh, likewise. It's been a pleasure, guys. Really, thank you for, I know you've got that unique little AI tool you've created. And like I said, when we were chatting you know, before this podcast, I guess I can't really. I like to stay under the radar, but I guess I can't hide anymore because you found me. I think, right? I mean, Don, I think it was you. So you did whatever on this cool little AI tool you've created. And it's funny because it seems like every week, and I want to say it started. I think it started with you. Every week now, somebody in franchising is creating an AI tool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And every week. And then there was one in the restaurant space that, Aller, or my CEO, shared with my colleague Sheila and I yesterday. And I've got to look at that one next. But it's just like, what are they going to think of next?
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Crazy.
creating efficiency.
Crazy. But again, I seriously, though, I really appreciate you guys reaching out to me, and I'm honored to have been included on this podcast. And hopefully I made sense.
Yes, Paul. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to the audience for listening. We will definitely
Yes.
put Paul's contact info where you can find Paul as well.
You
So,
bet.
thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you all.